Good afternoon, Kabafest. So my name is Abduljalal Musa Aliyu, and with me is Deborah Johnson, Alhan Islam, and Richard Ali, and we are here to make a case for poetry. You see, I know that there are already millions of questions that would come after this panel, so we'll just dive in straight, so we'd have time for the questions. You see, we used to have exceptional popular poets in northern Nigeria. Um, Dr. Aliyu Namangi, Moody speaking, household names. But today, probably 1 out of 10 readers in northern reach poetry. Happens. Where did the disconnect come from? Why do we not have a lot of poetry readers and listeners in northern Nigeria?
Hi, thank you so much for that question. I think that poetry has been, just like you rightly said, has been also like part of the northern culture in its way. But today, again, like the issue of having more poetry readers and listeners, I'll give myself as an example. I'm not much of a reader, but I love to interact with visuals, and sometimes I like to listen. So I feel like it's not, we shouldn't like make it a case of there are no readers, but can we explore other formats that poetry can be expressed and then test the market? Because for me, like also with visuals, that's how I've been able to create, or get the attention of the audience that subscribe to my content. And I feel like people like to see people sometimes. And of course, poetry allows you to tell your truth. So I think that's what I would say to that.
Thank you. Mr. Richard, you are the page poet here. So what are you going to say about this?
Yeah, so while I am a page poet and my poetry has primarily been written on the page, I also understand the changing dynamics of our society. And we have lived, I mean, I'm one of those ones who started with the comment, torrent sharing, MP3 files, and all of that. So in my period, I have seen this great shift towards digital mass means of communication. And these are the things that reach even further places than page poets have ever reached. When we speak about moody speaking, for example, if you are not from Kano, particularly, do not care, and those people, moody speaking might not appeal to you, but there moody speaking dealt with, and they are now using YouTube and Instagram. Is also one of us from northern Nigeria. He put together a powerful album. Those major issues that people like moody speaking have spoken. Better. So it's not about page poetry has its transition. They are able to transition to other mediums of expression. That should be on the poetry itself. That's of a hand deal, and the medium becomes your.
Oh, okay. So I said poets transitioning to spoken poetry, and at this point in my life, I'm currently exploring writing as a page poet, trying to see how that just will affect my writing, how that will affect me, what else I can bring from that. I would say that there are a lot of northern poets whose work, Zainab Ilyasu Bobby, for instance, who of whom I'm a very big fan, whose work is resonating with a lot of people outside the country. Abubakar Sadiq, young people whose work is resonating with people outside the country, um, if not entirely with people inside the country or even in the north. I think that I don't know how percentage of people I would say that are I know my friends in who read poetry might not be statistic to say I will enjoy it, still an enjoyable art. But yes, like Alhan Islam said, there's just it's just some ways to spread video content, to listen to video content.
So are we saying the future of Northern Nigerian poetry?
Um, let me say it like this. In northern Nigeria, we have this culture, Nadandeli, and like people gather to watch people, and then even the songs that they sing, also you can classify it as some form of poetry. And people gather to. I mean, there are writers, people, page poets. But I feel like there's also that culture, still sort of in us. And I feel like, yes, maybe the future of Northern Nigerian poetry is spoken word or like
Um,
performances.
all right.
Maybe.
What do you think, Richard Ali?
No, I wouldn't go so far as to say, or maybe let me make it a slightly more nuanced. It's not that the future of Northern Nigerian poetry is spoken word, but spoken word is definitely a part of the current reality of Northern Nigerian poetry and will most likely continue in its future. However, we're also going to see what we are seeing as spoken word is actually the rise of multimedia. So we're going to see more of it. We're going to see 2D animation. We're going to see animation poetry, where a poet comes and he creates a piece of animation that perhaps only he can create because of the algorithms and the software that he has used in order to render his poem in that way. And that is going to be a future way of poetry. The spoken word that we're talking about now, that is what is going on now. But imagine a situation where you have this billboard or this signage, and that is now the medium. And suddenly a poet has a way to play with images that come and text and word, and suddenly the poem itself becomes an installation, a performance piece in its entirety. So spoken word is where Northern Nigerian poetry is now. It's its present. It's likely to play a long way in its future. But what we're going to see is the increasing rise of the use of multimedia in order to get the message out there. People have been moving towards the internet since the 1980s, since the mid 80s, and it's going to continue. 4G, 5G, Starlink, whatever comes after that, people will continue to go there. And whether we like it or not, which is a good thing, there's always a hunger for culture. Everybody, everywhere in this world has a hunger for culture. And poets will continue to satisfy this hunger for culture, whether it is to see themselves in a better light or to correct anomalies in society, or just to view how we got here in the eyes of this person who has a special perspective. So that is my take on that.
Deborah, what would you say? Thank you very much. um, so there has been endless debates that Nigerian poetry dwells too much. Yeah. Carl Teva, who is, I would explain it. I have read at least 20 essays that critic grief. In fact, there's this critic, Carl Teva, that said that Nigerian poetry is on its knees, begging Nigerian poets to leave it alone on Twitter. You know, he, he's from Benue. So, what would you say about that? How would you respond as Northern?
Not working. Oh, okay, it's working. Um, I don't agree. I think I think if you read poems that are popular or you read a lot of yeah, poetry that is in the mainstream media and it is focused on grief, you have that opinion. But you cannot generalize and say all Nigerian poets focus on grief, because you have not even listened to, there's so many voices that are on, so many talented voices that are unheard in the poetry space. And even in the mainstream, I wouldn't say so. I think that for someone like Titilope Shonuga, who explores, she does explore a lot of grief in her poems, but there's still so much hope. I was reading something and they spoke about how, or was it someone here that said it yesterday? But something is in my head of somebody saying that in times, in dark times or in times of grief, it is, they cannot demand that you give them hope. People cannot demand that if it's what you are going through, you write about, and if you are grieving and you are writing about that, I don't think that that's a problem. But I don't agree that Nigerian poets focus on grief.
Alhan?
Yeah, I totally agree with Deborah, especially the part that she said, if this is what you're going through and that's put it out there, there is nothing wrong with it. And you cannot really demand that of a poet, except if you're commissioning a poet to say come perform a certain piece at a certain event. That's different. But when you're trying to portray your truth, and maybe also has to do with problems that we're going through in Nigeria and the loss and stuff like that. But I think that because poetry is something that it's like you're taking something from yourself. And in the world, I like to say it's all, and if the gender is female, you can't change it, right? And so I feel like you cannot separate a poet's reality in a lot of cases with their poems, except if it's when this is what I feel like giving y'all. I'm gonna
All
give
right.
it.
Richard?
Yeah, I mean, I think Kalteva is a good friend of mine, but I think he was being unnecessarily dismissive in that comment. And the reason why is that poetry, particularly the poetry that I see, often than not is people expressing reality and their hopes and their dreams. And it is not the fault of the poet and the writing that we live in very bleak times. And often than not, it's not even about writing poems of hope. Sometimes the purpose of the poem is to show you this reality or to show you how you got there. And that doesn't mean it's about grief. No, it's about, look, this is what you did, and this is where we are. And sometimes the poetry, I mean, look at the poetry of Umar Abubakar Sidi, who just about beauty, about love, about the sheer exhilarating beauty of the written word. You listen to things by DK or Bash Amuneni, who is also from northern Nigeria, the things that Alhan Islam has done and Debbie Johnson have done, they are social issues. Surely not all these things are about grief. So often that has a certain praxis with which they view the world. And where there is evidence that not to that praxis, you would put it there. So while there is the possibility that there's a larger context of an essay, perhaps, in which Kalteva says that, that sentence alone, if it is representative of his argument, I think it's unnecessarily dismissive. And I also think it is incorrect.
I would like you to answer this question first. Um, do you think a word, a single word, could be a cliche? Because people have thread, body, water, metaphor, overuse Nigerian poetry, and you say about that. Do you think a single word could be a cliche?
Okay, so maybe I should turn it its meaning. If the word has not lost its meaning, how can it be a cliche? The entire point with something being so much, so weary, so torn apart that you don't even, it doesn't have an impact. But the body is a particularly powerful word because once you say it, everybody thinks of their own body. to acquire over the course of our lives, and the love that that same body has been given. And the idea of the metaphor, whether as a word or as an idea, is an extremely powerful one, because we would imagine that everybody who is sitting here is sitting here because 5,000 years ago he had ancestors who were alive, and he's the descendant of that. What is a more flesh and blood example and the people who are sick, powerful ideas that poets deal with, and it cannot become a cliche. It's not possible. And I've also said something, which is that beyond the words themselves, poets are dealing with sound. If when somebody from, okay, let's say Deborah Johnson, and stream it in Russia, and I would still get the same sort of in here, because it's about the sound. If sound by itself cannot become a words themselves become cliche, that's not possible.
Thank you very much. Alhan? So Deborah, you've been on where you performed poetry. So I'd like to know how you started and how did you overcome your fears
When I started writing in general, or
performing poetry?
performing poetry on those stages,
No.
or performing poetry.
On stage?
Normal fears that you're climbing the stage, you trip on your shoes, or that you forget your lines, or that you say a wrong word, or that you just make a mistake. I think the normal fears were my fears, and also that the people, in terms of if you're writing something that does not really like the World Slam in Brazil, there was just on Africanism, and they were not Africans. There was the fear of, but I like to believe that poetry really transcends all of these things. And even now, even on Thursday, the performance, I was scared. I was very scared. But in the moment that you are on that stage and you are speaking, everything melts away because nothing else matters. You are just in the art. And yeah, so I think focusing more on that than anything else really does help you overcome it.
Thank you very much. Alhan, how do you respond to that?
Yeah, I think I'll just add to that. I think when you're on stage, it's almost spiritual, especially when you have worked on body, mind, and soul to become one. So you're just like more focused on telling your truth. I remember when I started, like Mama Ella said, I was really nervous because I consider myself an accidental poet. I was a science student. And the only reason I started poetry was because my aunt was abused and I wrote a letter to the husband. And my mom found it. And my mom found it and said, this has elements of poetry. And I said to her, I don't know what poetry is. And she pulled out a letter she wrote to my dad, and she said she wrote a poem for my dad. And she showed me, and I said, oh, this is poetry. And she said, yes. And she said, can we make a video of this? And I was shy. I was 13. And until I was 16, she came back again. And then I did that. And then that was when Mama Ellis found me. So the first time I was getting on stage, I was like, yo, will they understand my reality, right? And also, like, my accent is a Babur accent. It also has like a lot of R. So what if I go I was actually scared of how they will receive it. But honestly, shout out to my mom, shout out to Mama Ellis, and shout out to Arifai. And also the people that did see me and supported me and said, listen, get on that stage and just deliver fire. I always remember that. Yeah. So, yeah.
Thank you very much. So, like I said, we have so many young poets, especially when it comes to spoken word, trying to be like you, Deborah, and you, Alhan. So I want to know, when it comes to commercialization of your art as a poet, where do you draw a line? Because I have met people that told me that, look at Alhan, She's making money from poetry. Oh. Look at Deborah. She's going on stages on the world. It means poetry can make you money. So I want to know, where do you draw a line when it comes to commercialization of your art? Start, Alhan. Yes.
Okay. I think that I draw the line when certain topics do not align with my values, but also that is not to say that when it's like about social justice or seeing people for who they are, that I reject that. But I think that I gauge certain things in accordance to like my values, and I try to make sure that I'm not forced to change myself in any way that is not advancing. And I mean, I love culture, so I'm also culturally inclined. And I think also I basically just want to, be seen by every young northern Nigerian girl to say, listen, I can still maintain my identity and I can still fly. So I think when it comes to commercialization, I'm like there. Yeah.
Deborah?
Um, you might know.
Do you want to use mine? It's all right. Let her
Okay. For me, I just started entering the commercialization. And it's something I've been thinking about, not just on drawing the line when it comes to your values, but also on your art. Does it have to go everywhere? Does it have to enter every space? No matter how much they are paying, even if it is something that you are passionate about, why is it necessary that you do this thing? Why is it necessary that you do this performance? Do you need to do it? Will doing it rob you of your soul? Will doing it, how does it affect you? What do you like yourself after you've done the performance? And as a young person who is in Nigeria's hustle culture, I oftentimes have it in my head that, oh, you have to make money, you have to make more money. But then I don't think that you can have all the money in the world and have watered down your art and have robbed yourself of the joy of creating that you had in the first place and feel satisfied. You will never feel satisfied. You will never feel enough. You will feel empty and you feel like you are lacking something. And so these days, I say no a lot. I didn't used to say no. I would, because I was trying to, I wanted to do a lot. I wanted to push myself. Oh, I can do it this week. I can go again next week. These people want me there. I will go. But then I just started asking myself, do I need to? What has this person done? And it might feel like a bit of pride, but I think that art is very sacred. What's these people that are asking you to come to this place, do they deserve you to pour out your soul for them, for their 50,000, for their 5 million? No, I'm not saying 50,000 is small. No. I'm just giving an example. I'm like, any amount, even if it's 5 million, even if it's 10 million, just is will you like yourself after? Will you like what you've written? Will you be at peace here? Will it still feel sacred? Because it is a sacred thing. You should not just, like somewhere in the Bible, it says, do not cast your pearls to pigs. And it might feel very harsh, but yes.
Thank you very much, Deborah. So, Richard, I would love to ask this for the page poets. See, I'm the creative director of Poetic Wednesdays. What I'm saying is, I read a lot of poems. I read a lot of essays that critique poets and poetry. So there has been this debate about what makes a poem Nigerian. What are those elements that if I read them in a poem, I know that, okay, this is a Nigerian poem? Because people have been saying, Nigerian poetry has been westernized too. You go to magazines, you read poems, and then the next thing, you're like, okay, who is this poet? If they remove the poet's name, you wouldn't know where the poet is from. You wouldn't know that the poet is in Nigeria. So I want to know what makes a poem Nigeria.
Okay, so here's the thing, all right? I come to it from a slightly different perspective. What makes a poem Nigerian is if its writer is Nigerian. The poem itself is not something that can be limited to any geography or culture. It is merely, we have to research, we have to categorize. So it is easy to say, okay, this is Nigerian poetry because a Nigerian wrote it. But the poetry itself, it's like light. Do you have Nigerian light and Afghan light? No. That is it. So, so the poet. No. So the thing is this. All right. See, poetry is touching the very stuff of existence. The very, very stuff of existence that it's made of. We always play these games. The Christians play the game where they would let there be light, isn't it? That's how this whole thing started. Eh? The scientists, the Muslims, they tied on to that with the Judeo-Christian Islamic idea of the creation of the world. It starts with that creation of light. The scientists go with the Big Bang and sound that started and then light and all of that. What the poet is actually talking is that very, very stuff of existence. And it transcends nationalities, it transcends even genders and all of that. And that is why when a poem, and I've given this example again, if a poem really, really does what it's supposed to do, it does not matter where the poet comes from, in which language it is written, it's going to touch that person who is there waiting for that poem to discombobulate their lives and rearrange it. So this entire fixation with Nigerian poetry, I think it's extremely silly. And it's unfair as well, because you're asking people to who are the children of the entire universe to limit themselves to 1,000,000 square kilometers in one corner of West Africa. Why should they? Why should they? I want to see poems that are timeless, that are powerful, that will bring down the walls of Babylon, as it were, here, yesterday, and in the future. Why should it be limited to a corner of the River Niger basin here? So I think it's unfair to say that there's something missing in Nigerian. Why is Neo Shundari such a powerful global voice? Yes, he is a Nigerian poet, but it's because of the way his Eye of the Earth and Waiting Laughters resonates in people who have never even heard of Nigeria.
Okay, thank you very much, Richard. I'd like to ask Alhan and Deborah just one question, and then we go to the audience. So Alhan, I don't know how many people, after it was out that I'm going to moderate this panel, asked me to ask you, yes, to ask you let me say, okay, let me rephrase the question. Just tell us 3 elements, 3 things that someone should do if they want to become a good spoken word artist.
Okay, this feels like a setup question because I myself had to learn as I started speaking. Like I said, I'm an accidental poet. I didn't get on stage with like some set of rules. I didn't even know the rules of poetry, and I don't think I still abide by them. But I would say that number one, again, please just speak your truth. Do not feel like my words are not good enough, right? Speak your truth. You can work on them later, but your reality, your truth, get yourself to a point where you're comfortable and then go ahead and do that. And you would see that you would also fix yourself as you're growing. You can't know it all at a go. So I wouldn't say like they're like some set of rules, but definitely I would say work on self-development, right? So it's like I want to get on stage, I want to start to speak, or I don't want to read the poem on a paper. No, I want to cram the poem. Then what are the little things that you can do to get there? Start doing those things. It's not about like having this set of rules. Okay, when I get on stage, you would get there, but like just start with the basics. I need to maybe work on my what's it called now? I need to work on public speaking, right? I need to work on How do I hide my stage fright more? Because I feel like you never get over stage fright. You just get better at hiding it. So those little things, right? What kind of spoken word poet do I want to be? Do I want to be the one that when I get on stage, I'm moving and like it's all of that? Is it my voice that I want to capture people and I'm just standing, right? So just identify those things. When you have the answer, the rest of the things would come
Thank
easy.
you very
Thank you.
much. Deborah.
Okay, in the words of Moyosala Olorokre, you are a good poet already. But something practical that I would say helps is consuming a lot of poetry. If you want to be a spoken word artist, there are so many pages on YouTube, button poetry. There are so many pages. There's even orange poetry that is more Nigerian, that has a lot of Nigerian voices. So I used to do that before I even did anything on any stage. I was just always on YouTube. I was watching, I was consuming, I was learning, I was seeing different ways to attack something by. And then of course just knowing why do you want, or what are you looking for, what do you want, just having that in your mind at all times. And one last thing I would say is, wow, I actually
Thank you very much. So, questions? Um, you.
I think the host asked a very valid question, but to my surprise, it was dismissed by all the three panelists. He asked a question about the relationship between poetry and grief, which the critic Carl Teve was begging on Nigerian poets to stop writing on grief. I think one of the greatest thinkers of this century, Malcolm Gladwell, dedicated a complete chapter to discuss the life and death of the great poet Sylvia Plath. In that particular chapter, in the opening chapter of the book, he said this passage. It is very short. Let me quote it. Poets die young. That is not just a cliche. The life expectancy of poets as a group trails playwrights, novelists, non-fiction writers by a considerable margin. They have higher rate of emotional disorders than actors, musicians, composers, and novelists. And of every occupational category, poets have far and away the highest suicide rate, as much as 5 times higher than the general population. Something about writing poetry appears either to attract the wounded or to open new wounds. And few have so perfectly embodied that image of the doomed genius as Sylvia Plath. And this is not just an international data from Malcolm Gladwell. I still remember one Sunday morning on the 12th of May in the year 2019, a young Nigerian student in the University of Nigeria, Nsukka, he wrote a suicide note, and we listened to the news of his death. I think there is a case for grief. You've asked the question, they dismiss it. I'm not attacking poetry. I'm saying there is a problem. Can we discuss a solution to it? This is the question. We don't just dismiss it. It is a problem because it is backed by data. The data is there showing that poets are attracted to that. Thank you.
Yeah, I think. From, okay, you want to answer? Okay.
Sorry. Okay, thank you. Thank you. So thank you so much for your comment. But we didn't dismiss it exactly, right? And I think Sir Richard kind of like framed it really well and opened it up. So I give you an example with myself. I love to write about grief. I lost my mom 6 years ago, and I love it. And poetry has, you know, become like a realm of healing for me. So I think that it depends on the perspective. Data is going to be data. There are people that kill themselves outside being poets and artists, right? And I don't think that it is fair to dwell on saying poets are killing themselves, so stop writing about grief. I know that the poem I wrote about losing my mother resonated with so many people that someone reached out to me to say, listen, I'm finding this as a sense of healing. So we didn't dismiss it. We just validated that it is okay to tell your truth.
I have a question on language for each of the panelists. For Debbie, my question is, when you performed, for example, at the Poetry Slam, World Poetry Slam in Brazil, you were performing in English to an audience that was completely not an English audience. So how do you navigate such a space whereby you perform in English, but you are able to come second in such a stage that they understood what you're saying without really understanding English? For Mariam, my question is, when you're performing the artist English, how do you navigate and co-produce a work both in English and Arabic with another artist? For Richard, on language, when you worked on the translation of Nguge's work, how does that work in terms of translating from an African language to within other African languages, especially for poetry? Okay, 30 seconds.
Okay, it's working. Yeah, so the Brazil one was really exciting for me because they had screens like these, and they translated the poems. They took the scripts of the poems some months before. They translated it to French, to Spanish, to Portuguese. I can't remember which other one, but they had different translations because the audience was full of people who spoke different languages. It was like the Tower of Babel. But the performances, there was just so much soul in every performance. You're trying to read, you're watching, and you are getting it because you can feel what is being done.
Alhan?
For once, I thought I was part of the audience. I think when I had to like co-curate that piece with the UAE poet at COP28, the first thing ask her own vision for the poem, give that space and so that it can sort of foster that collaboration spirit and not take up space all the time. And so when I did that and then, started asking her about culture and stuff, because it's like, I got a little vibe of like, you're coming to the UAE, I'm the poet in the UAE kind of thing. And like, so I had to be like, yo, chill, like we're in this together. And then like, after the walls did come down, then I started asking her about her poetry. What's your vision? And then she became like the driver. And then that sort of made it easy for me to come in and say, listen, I think let's do it this way. And then at the end of the day, what we did was to make sure that the call to action was the same. And we said, let's use the power of repetition for that. So that even if they don't get the entire the warriors there could take that, added like holding hands because we needed to make each other feel comfortable. So yeah.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much, Sada. Now, so the question of translation is something I'm very passionate about, but most of that work has been done by Jalada Africa, and it's not my personal work. So I'm currently managing editor of Jalada Africa, which is based in Nairobi. And what we have done with translation, because we realize how important translation is, particularly from one African language to another, Wale Soyinka gave us a poem on Malala Yousafzai, the dissidences of Malala Yousafzai, Nelson Mandela, and of course his own personal dissidence. And we have translated this into 50 languages and counting. This follows the translation project of an Ngugi short story into 100 languages, mostly African languages.
So you have 10 seconds left.
Yeah, so in the I have left, it's something I'm passionate about and translate to. In order to render to another language, and that's what
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The host, Mr. Richard, a Nigerian poem. As he made mention or reference to used, if I will say that, like, and Mr. Richard answered that in a vacuum. It usually, yeah, I'm coming to the questions. Sorry, please. The word clearly came across portrait in art, paintings. Artists, right, have drawn their own portraits. So my question here is, we see a kind of observed that since Roku Yogun, especially young Nigerian poets, whereby you see water as water, mother has become a water, and so this kind of. So is there a conscious Nigerian tradition, Nigerian poetic tradition, as we see of the French symbolists, the American imagists, the United Kingdom romantics, and other sort of the. So is there a Nigerian poetic tradition?
Thank you. He understands.
As important as creating the work is, the poet is not the person who is going to intellectualize it. You have journalists for that, you have academics for that. And it's after the fact that they'll call it an imagist poem, or they'll typify it in this way or the other. It is enough for the poet to create his work and to create the very, very best work. Romeo Riogun, who you have mentioned, or me, or any of these people, we are considerably at the height of our powers now. And the academics and journalists who will chronicle these things and 10, 20 years from now would tell us what it is that we're doing here. So it's a bit of a difficulty to pile that, the need to typify on the need to create. Let us allow our poets to create in their own time as best as they can.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. We're taking just one question from here. And then, okay. Yeah, go.
Hi, my name is Alhan Islam. My question is for Alhan Islam. You mentioned that you're not much of a reader, and I think the general consensus is reading does help to improve and refine your art. So my question for you is, how do you refine and improve your art?
Yeah, so I'm not much of a reader, but I love to listen. And like I said, I love to engage with visuals. And also, I think that speaks through my work where most of my content is like videos. Because I think when I started and like as I was advancing, I wanted to create something for people like myself also. And I'm not excluding anyone, but like also bringing everyone on board as we carry on. So yeah, thank you. I think we're like,
Wait, please. Let me take Nasiba's question. She's my mentor. She's going to kill me if I don't take her question. Please, give her a mic. I don't want to die.
Thank you very much. I really had to talk because you sit down here trying to make a case for poetry, and nobody talked about the challenges of publishing poetry collection in Nigeria. Publishing houses do not like accepting poetry manuscripts. Every year, publishing houses makes call for collections. Masobe just did, and there is no room for poetry. So I'm trying to direct a specific question to Uncle Richard because he's a publisher. Why do you think Nigerian publishers do not like publishing poetry? That is one. Secondly, what do you think is the role of social media? Because we have this argument that social media is turning everybody into a poet. They serve you breakfast, you become a poet. Then the third thing I want to talk about is there's also this argument and some sort of, I don't know, is it misunderstanding, is it fight between people that write conventional page poetry and spoken word artists. Sometimes conventional poets feel like spoken word artists are diluting the essence of poetry. What do you think about that?
Okay, so I'm going to weigh in very briefly on the publishing landscape of poetry. Now, publishing in Nigeria is a labor of love. Nobody who is a publisher owns a publishing house in Nigeria owns one to make money. I've been at the center of Parisia since 2012, and I don't think there's a year we've really made money. So beyond even publishing poetry is an even greater labor of love. But this is a labor of love that Umar Sidi and I have embraced with Konya Shamsruni. And it's basically the only poetry publishing press on this continent that publishes only poetry. We have published chapbooks by Fumi Gaji, by Razak Malik Bolahon. And the idea was for us to make enough money to print the next year. This is the third year now, and we're only just finally doing it. And that is why we're bringing you on board. And maybe it's a bit premature, but we'll be publishing Nasiba Babale and Ismail Bala in the coming months. So it is important for the publishing landscape, it's important to find those people who will do it fisabilillah, because other than that, it simply would not be done. But I feel that poetry is important, and that fisabilillah, that for the love of God, it's important to do it, even if it takes me 3 years to shift 1,000 copies of poetry.
Just answer the question about, they say you guys are diluting poetry, please.
Yes. So I'd like to answer that because at the World Poetry Slam, that is centered only for slam poetry, for spoken word poetry, they had panels on this, on speaking of how people who are page poets who go into academia with poetry say that spoken word is diluting. And their entire manifesto, why they started the World Poetry Slam, was to create a space for spoken word poets, for slam poets, because it is just as important. I look at page poetry and I see so much depth. I see there's so much you can learn from it as a spoken word poet. I agree that a lot of people do not look to that, but I don't think that my spoken word poetry is less important than a page poet. I think that the work it is doing is the same. The message it is passing is the same. And if I feel like I write and I want to use my body, I want to use my body in this poem, I want to use my voice to carry this poem, I should not be shamed for that.
Thank you, Deborah. I just sheatheded my sword. Thank you very much.
I think we've come to the end of the session. Thank you very much.